Welcome to Shift, a college admissions, ACT, and SAT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT test. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions that are backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, a built in study planner, and full length practice exams. You can get a free trial by visiting achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast gets you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we have Rob Franklin from Admissionado, and just really excited to talk to him today. Rob, would love if you could introduce yourself and a little bit about you and your company.
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Rob Franklin. I am a writer and an essay editor, as well as a college admissions consultant for a company called Admissionado. And we basically, we have kind of two. Um, we pretty much shepherd students through kind of the entire college admissions process, both providing high level comprehensive strategy for the breakdown of schools that they're applying to, what they should be writing their essays about, who they should be asking for recommendations, etc., as well as actually helping them through the drafting process so that by the time they've kind of gone through a few edits with us on each of their essays, everything's sort of like publish ready, ready to put in front of an admissions committee.
Mhm. Very cool, yeah. And so today, on the topic of admissions, we've got a really kind of a very important and macro one, which is that SCOTUS just recently had their affirmative action ruling, which, if you aren't sure what that is, or if you just haven't heard for some reason about this, basically the Court reversed the general idea of affirmative action in entirely. I don't know if that's fair to say, but it's pretty much struck down. And I think maybe to start, just like it would be good to have you give some like background on what affirmative action was and then like why or then what the Supreme Court ruling sort of specifically does. And then we can kind of talk through what the ramifications are and the implications.
Yeah, so the court's decision, it was 6-2 technically,
Hmm.
because one of the justices had to recuse herself. And it basically struck down kind of 4 years of 4 decades of precedent in college admissions and affirmative action. And
Hmm.
so this decision, which reverses precedent, um, basically determined that consciousness in college admissions is no longer legal. And so it was looking at two institutions in particular, Harvard and UNC. So the oldest private university in the country and the oldest public university in the country, that had first been sued by an organization called Students for Fair Admissions in 2014. Obviously, that case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, which is why we're hearing about it. Um, and the decision essentially agreed with Students for Fair Admissions, who'd sued, saying that Asian American students or Asian students, who had as a group kind of the highest SAT and grade scores, higher than any racial group, including white people, um, were being discriminated against in college admissions. So their numbers, we can get into the numbers a little bit later, but basically, that decision was released 3 weeks ago. It kind of radically alters the sort of calculus in college admissions. Justice Roberts, um, in his dissenting opinion, um, did say that nothing in this opinion can be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. So I think we can kind of like probe that statement, and
Hmm.
what SCOTUS is saying in terms of like the sort of immediate implications of this decision. Um, but yeah, basically, affirmative action as it has existed for the last half century is no more.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that actually is maybe a good place to start a little bit because I am. curious what it was about affirmative action itself that the Supreme Court disagreed with, but they didn't disagree with the idea of colleges considering race. So it's like you're allowed to consider it, but not in a systematized way. It has to be in an abstract way. Like that was always kind of bizarre to me.
Yeah, it has to be in a far less elegant kind of like potentially much more complex way. Yeah, I mean, so the precedent that existed until this decision basically operated on the idea um, and a kind of a value system that most colleges will still uphold, which is that
Hmm.
these colleges, let's use Harvard as the example because it was actually one of the cited institutions in this case. Like Harvard's promise is not just providing a great education, it's also providing basically this kind of like microcosm of like the best um, of people from around the world, 18 to 22-year-olds for the undergraduate population for the most part. Um, the kind of best of the best young people from an array of backgrounds, countries, first languages, religions, and ethnicities, etc. And so critical to that kind of tapestry that they're trying to put together. In addition to not wanting every single person to be an athlete or every single person to be a computer programmer, is people who have different racial and ethnic identities. Um,
Hmm.
and so, I mean, critics of this decision, myself included, would say um, that striking down kind of race conscious affirmative action um, lessens these institutions' ability to create that sort of tapestry that they strive to create, and is also like part of why they're sort of sought after institutions. People want that experience.
Hmm. Well, it's also kind of it's like you said, it's like they're specifically trying to prevent these institutions from creating that tapestry intentionally. Um, it is bizarre because it's a little bit of like, shouldn't they have the freedom to do whatever they want, right? They're private institutions.
Yeah, it's this kind of technicality, basically because they do receive some federal funds. So
Mm.
private institutions, your Harvards, your Yales, your Stanfords, they still receive some federal funding. So as part of the Civil Rights Act, which basically prohibits discrimination in both public and private institutions, they are still bound by this decision. Versus public institutions like UNC, are more obviously bound by federal law.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's all kind of it's a strange to me. I felt like the court's decision was strange, right? Like, but because they're kind of trying to argue that essentially there's no you can't have preferential treatment, but then they left open the door to give preferential treatment based on like what people say in their essays
Yeah.
instead of what they check the box on their common application. So it's yeah, it's pretty bizarre. I mean, I think that or I mean, for me, I think that the key thing here is that um, they're trying to say basically. I think that the point, quote unquote, was to say that you can't favor people based on race,
Precisely.
I guess.
Yeah.
But then the colleges are still going to, right? Like, I mean, that's the thing is Harvard basically released a statement that was like, we really encourage keep people to incorporate their journey as a minority in the essay section, right? And they're legally allowed to consider that. So already, like, all these colleges are basically like, well, here's how we're going to try and achieve those tapestry goals anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would say kind of two things to that, where it's like, yeah, the first reason that it's sort of illogical, and we'll see how this story develops, but it's they've struck down this one means of creating diversity in a college class, racial diversity, on the grounds that it basically gives an advantage to certain racial groups in comparison with others. But they haven't struck down other forms of advantages in college admission. So, for instance,
Well, right.
recruited athletes, legacy admissions, children of staff, and we can kind of get into some of the numbers with that. But then this other point that you're making, um, around around like how it's going to be kind of incorporated into the essays. Um, yeah, they're playing. I mean, it's it's going to be tricky from the admissions committee's perspective because they're going to be walking a very narrow line under quite a bit of scrutiny, where technically they're still able to consider uh, one's racial, ethnic identity in the context of how that has impacted your journey and who you are today, as evidenced in letters of recommendation, one's essay, etc. Um,
Mhm.
they, however, are no longer able to basically collect that data in the application. So there will be no box where you check off your race and ethnicity, which opens up a host of other complications where, I was listening to the New York Times podcast, like did an episode on this. And one of the people they interviewed was making, I think, the very good and fair point that potentially with the way that we've kind of shifted now students who are not from um, a sort of underrepresented ethnic minority, um, if they wanted to, they could kind of hint heavily in their essays as to, um, their own kind of difficulties related to their racial background and sort of manipulate this new paradigm in a way that's
Mhm.
just going to, like, I think very quickly become um, just complicated.
Well, it's messy too. I mean, yeah, whenever there's a system, people will try to sort of twist it to their advantage, and then whenever there's a unclear system, that just gives more opportunity for that, right? And the other thing too that's interesting is like I feel like if you in a college admission setting submitted your race as one race and it was actually the other, I feel like there was like consequences for that. Or there was some level of like, you have to be telling the truth versus like if you're in an essay saying or heavily implying that you're a race that you're not, especially the heavily implying part, I feel like there isn't really any repercussions for that.
It also leaves, kind of puts the onus on admissions committee readers, which,
Suddenly be detectives. Yeah.
yeah, like that's not really like what they're trained for. I mean, I think, Harvard released a statement, that the statement that you kind of referenced, that was co-signed by sort of all of their top brass. So their outgoing president, their new president, who is a black woman who kind of came in right after this decision was released, their deans, etc., basically saying kind of what you referenced, that they will continue to, while they're going to honor this Supreme Court decision, they will continue to consider um, stories around how one's identity impacted your journey and how that kind of aligns with the college's goal, missions, values, and goals.
Yeah, no, so it's really for me, I think the first part that I feel like is going to be so okay, so if the technically the goal of the current SCOTUS is to say you can't basically like college admissions is federally funded, it's kind of like a protected class of thing, and we're gonna say that you can't change it based on things like or you can't make decisions based on things like race. Um, but you pointed out earlier there's a pretty obvious and probably more troublesome equality issue in a lot of ways, which is legacy admissions. I think I saw a statistic that I believe 44% of white Harvard students are legacy admissions. It's like it's insanely high. It's a ton. right? I need to go see if I can double check that, but
No, no,
like
no. I
it's
saw
certainly
maybe
not a negligible amount.
I saw maybe the same study. I mean, yeah, I was seeing a study um, by the National Bureau of Economic Research said 43% of white students admitted to Harvard were recruited athletes, legacy students, children of faculty and staff, or dean's
That's the
interest
one.
lists.
Okay.
Yeah, which is
So
basically so
that's
dean's
the stat I was
interest.
thinking of.
Yeah, dean's interest is applicants whose parents or relatives have donated in the past. So that's
Right.
43% of white students compared to about 16% for Black, Latino, and Asian American students. Um, so, and then if we broke out, I don't want to just speculate blindly, but, even within that 16, or looking at kind of Black, Latino, and Asian American students, um,
Mhm.
it is quite possible, given that Black people have only been attending these colleges for a little over a century. In some cases, I mean, with UNC, they started admitting Black students in 1955. Um, it's very possible that that number is even smaller for Black and Latino students, smaller than 16%. Um,
Right.
yeah, so it's like, okay, um, at least in the current state, we're upholding um, a very clearly kind of preferential system that disproportionately impacts white students and benefits white students, and striking down a system, yeah, that was the most effective tool that colleges had to guarantee a kind of racially diverse class, which again is part of what they're selling.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. The legacy admissions things got challenged like the next day, so I feel like that. I mean, it would be interesting to see if they're consistent, and then they chop that as well. Um, but I do think that the idea that, private universities have to be a total meritocracy is an interesting one, right? Because it's something that some people feel very strongly about, and then, on the other hand, they're private institutions. I think that it'll be something that unfolds like kind of over sort of waves. Like the first year is going to be weird. I think like over the next couple of years, like sort of a new system will emerge. But in the short term, right, as we're kind of looking at 2023 college admissions and 2024, like what do we think sort of the impacts are going to be of this? Like how do we think this is going to change things? I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is I think that schools are going to, my guess is that most schools are going to try really hard to reproduce what they already like have in terms of diversity, just with less information. That's my first guess, basically.
Yeah, I'm sure that that will be their goal. I mean, Harvard has already kind of reiterated their commitment to racial diversity on campus, and I think they're probably in the process of figuring out how they're going to go about that. Um, I mean, I think something first is like important to kind of establish or just mention, which is that, a school like Harvard and its sort of comps have less than 2,000 slots that they're filling. Um, and I mean, I think for Harvard, it's like 1,600 incoming slots. Um, their applicants, like, they have far more than that, who would be capable of academically excelling on campus. So, they've,
Yeah, way more.
yeah, like out of for the 2019 class, I was seeing stats that they had 35,000 applicants, about 4,000 with perfect math SAT scores, 3,000 with perfect verbal, over 8,000 with perfect GPAs. And I think anybody who's gone to these schools can say it's like, yeah, I mean, once you're there, the hardest part is getting in, and then once you're there, like, I mean, most good students could probably find a niche on campus and really thrive. So, um, they're already admissions committees are already in like a really tough spot trying to, as these schools have ever declining admissions numbers, 4% to 3% to 2%, um, are already in the tough position of differentiating between students, many of whom could thrive academically on campus, and saying, okay, what are like the externalities? What are the other factors that would help determine a student's preparedness for college, as well as like their likelihood of future success, which is what ultimately they're trying to approximate. Like all these top schools want to get whoever's going to be the president in 2050 or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
and so, yeah, like looking at what are these other traits that we can kind of incorporate that are significant and are indicators. I think like in the near term, the admissions committees are going to have a lot of difficulty um, reassessing and figuring out how to still include kind of the significance of one's racial and ethnic background in that picture of a student. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, like in short, like I think they're gonna have to be retrained. I think they're probably going to have to hire bigger admissions staffs, given that review of each individual application is likely to take longer if they're also taking on the role of kind of detective and trying to parse information on one's application to determine, like, oh, like perhaps this person is from X background.
Well,
Um,
that's the thing too, is like, are they even allowed if it's like an internal like system, right? Like let's say they probably have, at a bare minimum a spreadsheet of all the applications they have to read and like, what like people probably rate things or something. Like, is it going to be legal or illegal for them to have like a thing where it's like this person is probably this race, right? Like my guess is that that's probably illegal,
yeah, it's illegal, and so
right?
it's
So then it's like, but okay, so now you're just like, I really want to admit this guy, wink, wink. Like,
yeah. I mean, the way that it's structured, at least for a school like Harvard, like they read and review the applications, they give a sort of score. They have like a rubric of qualities that they're looking for. Each reader will give, say it's on a 1 to 5. I'm not sure exactly what the scale is, but um,
yeah.
as these admissions officers are starting to look at, like, okay, like they're being retrained to look at a student like holistically. Theoretically, yeah, the only way to sort of like bake it into the existing system is to say is to like let that kind of color the score. But again, like they're going to be under really tight scrutiny. And so if they did manage, say, to pull off having the same racial breakdown as they did before this decision, they're probably looking at another lawsuit that wants to investigate how exactly that process played out. And so
Well, right.
I
So they're going to be under the microscope,
yeah,
like even just out of fear.
completely. And I think, I mean, they're going to try, I'm sure, versions of affirmative act. This decision doesn't impact, say, like a kind of affirmative action based on socioeconomic status, um, slash class, based on geography, etc. So there are other kind of like hobbled together versions where they could look at schools with certain, racial breakdowns at the high school level, at the zip code level, etc. But nothing's going to be um, kind of as successful as the old system of just like considering that as a factor.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for our listeners here who are parents, right? I think they're all thinking about and kind of grappling with like these issues. And I just, for me, I guess the biggest thing I want to do with the rest of the episode is try to offer like sort of guidance on how to move forward, right? I think that I feel like we've covered the problems and like they're pretty clear, right? And I also don't really feel like we know what to do about it other than just like most likely these admissions committees are this is all they talk about and have talked about for the last like 2 months. So we'll see what they come up with. But in the meantime, for parents, I feel like for I don't know, for better or for worse, for white and Asian parents, the you probably change nothing. That's my guess. You kind of do everything that you were going to do the same way. Um, Unless, I don't know, you maybe wanted to make sure you don't like highlight your race in your essay, which is, I don't know if I can advise that one way or the other. But I do think that in the cases of the groups that affirmative action was focused on helping, I think that people in those groups probably should be thinking about how their essay can incorporate that part of their story. Because I think that that's kind of, it is kind of the only vehicle you have left, right? It's kind of the only, like, it's kind of the only pathway you have to, like, just make that part of your self known. And so I feel like that's something that's going to take a lot more prominence in the next couple of years, really. As you know, essay writing, I think, is suddenly going to be bifurcated depending on like what race you are.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in kind of looking around at just like what admissions experts have said in the wake of this, versus comparing it to my own opinion, I think like
Mhm.
the jury's kind of still out in terms of like what is the right strategy. So, some admissions experts are definitely saying Black and Brown students should absolutely in their essay, if not the Common App personal statement, then in their supplementary essays, at least once kind of explicitly mention their racial background, or their racial identity. Um, and so, there's opportunities to do that in the essays. Some admissions experts also say that your letters of recommendation can be an opportunity where obviously you don't write them, you don't control what goes in them, but you can signal to whichever teachers you're asking to write them on your behalf. Oh, like I thought, say there's a natural tie-in, say like you're a Latinx student who's asking one of your Spanish teachers, your AP Spanish teacher, to write a recommendation, because you didn't grow up speaking Spanish in the home. Like you could be like, oh, I'm asking you because I thought you could speak to like how I've not only excelled in the classroom, but I've really like adopted a sort of cultural aspect, and like this has helped to kind of bring out an aspect of my identity and help me kind of explore it further. Um,
Mhm.
you could kind of make that suggestion as like, this is why I'm asking you. Um, Often teachers really appreciate if you kind of give an indication of why you're asking them specifically for a recommendation anyway. So sort of planting that like it would be helpful if they made a mention um of your racial identity. So that is one school. Some experts are saying definitely kind of find a way to explicitly mention it. Others, I mean, it's not so much that they're saying that strategically that's a bad choice as that they're frustrated with the kind of options this new reality leaves us with. Um, so I mean, I think there's a lot of frustration around how Black and Brown students will likely feel pressure to make their admissions essays all about race. There's a common app. One of the common app prompts is, some students have a background, identity, interest, or talent that is so meaningful that they believe their application would be incomplete without it. This sounds like you. Please share your story. Which seems like, yeah, a great opportunity potentially to discuss your kind of cultural background. Um, but I do think it would be very unfortunate if all Black and Brown students felt the pressure to kind of answer that question and narrowly
Right.
focus, um, on their racial identity at the expense of like the rest of their story, their interests, their activities, their passions, everything else that's particular about them. So, I mean, in thinking
Mhm.
about this a lot and like, both wanting to advise students to be kind of strategic, and recognize that things are in flux and like there's no like new system that has been decided upon for students who are kind of applying in this or next admissions cycle. Um, but also wanting to encourage students to like still draw out what is so distinctive about them. Um, I think I thought a lot about my own kind of college application experience. I'm Black. I'm from the South. I went to a majority white prep school. Um, I grew up on the campus of a historically Black college. Like, there literally would not have been a way for me to write an essay, multiple essays about kind of who I am, where I came from, without some reference to racial identity. Um,
Mhm.
so I think, frankly, my advice is to students, if you genuinely feel like your race has had no impact on your life, your upbringing, and your kind of intellectual lens on the world, then feel free not to mention it. But for the rest of us, the vast, vast, vast majority, of course, it has impacted. Even something like how you view climate change, how you view the racial justice protests of the last 3 years, how you view COVID and its implications. Like, that's still filtered through the lens of race, because it impacts everything in our daily world. And I think you don't have to answer the question in a way that feels inauthentic or caricaturish. You can still filter your experiences, your passions, through your identity, and just kind of provide context on how that has sort of like deepened your commitment to your existing passions.
Yeah, and I also think that I don't know if this is like cynical to say or something, but like the worst case scenario when you don't include your background in your essays and things like that is that you're just like in the big bucket with everybody, right? Like you're just kind of then it's just like not a part of your essay. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you truly didn't feel like it fit, then it didn't fit, right? I think that's kind of the point. Like maybe that's like if you want to put on rose-colored glasses on what SCOTUS was trying to do, maybe that was the best possible spin you could have on it. You know, it should only matter if it matters. But yeah, it's interesting.
I would definitely advise people against, the sort of inelegant mention, like anything that's going to
Mhm.
feel, yeah, I guess just inauthentic, that feels like you kind of found a way to shoehorn it into your essay. Like, but I would say, to students that I'm working with right now, like, in the wake of this decision, if they were planning not to mention it at all, to consider how they could kind of meaningfully write an essay, like even if it's one of their supplementary essays, or their short answers. Um, yeah, that sort of
Yeah,
explores identity in a, yeah, in a kind of,
I think it's also just like it's just the way the world works, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you knew that if you could do a handstand, it would improve your college admissions chances, everyone would be signing up for handstand classes tomorrow, right? Like it doesn't really like I think everyone's trying to kind of be successful, right? And
totally.
and so you've gotta play the game as it is, not in the idealized version that you think it is. So that's where I would say I would if I were in your shoes, I would do the same thing. I would say, especially this year, like I'd try to like find a basically a thoughtful way to include it if I needed to.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Um, yeah, I mean, it's, you're basically like trying to pitch yourself on an application, and this should certainly, it never was and should never be like the only thing that you're telling you're telling about yourself.
Yeah.
That is not, that's not a sufficiently compelling pitch, but for most students it will inevitably be part of just what kind of makes you you, and what makes you like an exciting perspective, um, yeah, freshmen at any of these kind of elite schools.
Yeah, exactly. Well, great. Any kind of parting thoughts on this topic before we wrap up?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I'm sure I'll have many more thoughts immediately following this conversation. But
I know. Yeah, we can. Hey, we can always do another one later. Well, great. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Robert Franklin from Admissionado. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me. And if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off.